All right, welcome back to Module 3 of Bible Study That Matters. For the first 2 weeks, we've been dealing with reliable interpretation, what it means to read in a reliable way, basically being very careful with not only reading into the text, but also what are some good methods, what are some good tools that would help us read. And so the two big themes for reading the Bible in this class is reliability and relevance. We'll spend more time in the fifth module, the fifth week, with relevance. At this point, we want to look at what makes us good readers or what makes us good interpreters. So our first week, we dealt with this issue of good interpretation. And remember, you saw the video of the gentleman who talked about David and Goliath. And so in many ways, the first week was learning how to contextualize, a very important word, how to contextualize the passage that we're dealing with. The second week, we moved into genre. Remember, two of the most important things about genre are essentially what are the conventions to this particular genre, and then those conventions set up expectations. What do we expect from this genre? And so a large part of this class is learning how to read narrative, how to read prophecy, and now, of course, this week, how to read poetry and how to read apocalyptic literature. So it's interesting to note as we move into the third week that over 40% of the Old Testament is poetry. That's huge. If the Old Testament is 3/4 of the Christian scriptures, then 40% of that is poetry. And so we really can't be good readers, good interpreters of the Christian scriptures unless we learn how to read not only poetry, but how do we read Hebrew poetry? And we'll spend some time with that this week. I want you to leave this third week with a good idea of how to go into any passage that is poetry. And so, for instance, you'll know how to better read the book of Job. Even though Job has a little bit of narrative in it in the first 2 chapters, Job is predominantly poetry, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Lamentations. And then it's also interesting to note that out of the entire Old Testament, only one book has no poetry, and that is the book of Joshua. So we're going to look at the idea of poetry and how to read it, and then not only poetry, but Hebrew poetry. And then we're going to turn our attention for a few days to apocalyptic literature. In the Old Testament, there is one book that is apocalyptic, and that's the book of Daniel. And so it's very important that we see Daniel as an apocalyptic book, not as a prophetic book. Now that's a real difference between Judaism and Christianity. So the Jews see Daniel as apocalyptic literature, whereas Christianity has seen Daniel as a prophet. In fact, if you look at the Christian scriptures, you'll notice that Daniel is listed as one of the major prophets. Well, I have no problem really with calling Daniel a prophet or a prophetic book, but when we do that, we really miss the significance of what's going on with the book of Daniel. And so we're going to look at it as apocalyptic literature. And then, of course, there is one book in the New Testament that is apocalyptic, and that's the book of Revelation. And in fact, we as interpreters, we'll chat about this a little bit later, but we as interpreters cannot understand the book of Revelation unless we understand the book of Daniel. John, who wrote Revelation, knew Daniel and he knew apocalyptic literature very well. So again, as we come into now our third week, we're going to continue to think about genre. So don't forget conventions, and those conventions set up expectations. There are particular conventions to Hebrew poetry. I want you to know those, and we're going to take a real good look at those. And then those conventions give us expectations and give us an idea of not only why this was written, but then how it was written, and then for what purpose does it mean for our lives today. So once again, emphasizing reliability and reference. So for instance, let's just look very quickly at a very famous psalm. Most of you are familiar with Psalm 23. And when we read Psalm 23, we know that this is a beautiful psalm. We know how important it is in Judaism and in Christianity. I know personally for me, this psalm has been great comfort over certain periods of my life. But one of the problems with Psalm 23 is we read it only with a lens from 2014. Many times we, in fact, read more into the psalm rather than really trying to understand or to extract the meaning from the psalm, which of course we call exegesis. And if we don't have good exegesis, if we don't do a close reading of the text, then we're in danger once again of having subjective interpretation. We talked about this in the first week. So another problem with Psalm 23 is essentially we know it so well that we've encoded it with so much meaning that may have nothing to do with its original setting. So one of the first things that I invite my students to do with a psalm like this, Psalm 23, is to go in and ask a few questions. Again, what is the context for this psalm, the original context for this psalm, and then what are the conventions? So I want to ask, first of all, about Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. What is the context of the writing of this psalm? And essentially, unfortunately, we don't know a whole lot about that, but it's interesting to note that when the psalmist says, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, it should trigger something very different in the ancient mind than it does in ours. And so 3,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, a Hebrew reader would have heard this psalm, and as soon as he or she heard the term shepherd, they probably would have thought of, yes, the shepherd, but they also would have thought of the idea of the king. In the ancient Near East, and this is all over the culture at the time, the king was called a shepherd. And in fact, this really fits in later, if you will recall the verse that talks about setting a table before my enemies, in the presence of my enemies. This idea, once again, is a successful king who has overcome death, the valley of the shadow of death. And this king now, who has been successful, will set out a table, a big banquet in front of the people who have been defeated. And typically the people in the book of Psalms who have been defeated are the people who have been against Yahweh or Yahweh's people. So one of the most important things that we're going to learn this week is when we read Psalm 23, what is its historical context? What is its literary context? Then we need to turn to what are the conventions? And again, we'll come back to this in a couple of days. But in Psalm 23, Hebrew poetry, as usual, works with what we call parallelism. And parallelism essentially is, this isn't true for every occurrence, but essentially it is two lines, and line A makes a statement, and then line B comes in and says something about line A. And so the reason why it's called parallelism is we need to look at how line A, the Lord is my shepherd, interacts with line B, I shall not want. And so this, again, is something that is very central to Hebrew poetry, but it's also important to understand that Hebrew poetry 2,500 years ago works very differently than poetry does in our modern age. So let's take the time this week. I think this is something that is very exciting. You'll never read the Bible the same way again. Let's look at poetry up close and let's see what it means and also what it meant.